I wanted to tell you my first impressions of Santa Barbara
All right.
when I came in 1961, May, just out of college, just graduated from college at Iowa State. And I had made up my mind to come to Santa Barbara. I read an article about Santa Barbara and what a lovely place it was. And I wanted to come to California, get out of Iowa. So I did that. But anyway, when I first arrived in Santa Barbara, the first thing that I noticed was that there were no parking meters. In Iowa, there's always parking meters, and you have to have your pockets full of nickels and dimes. And I thought, this is really classy, that this town has got class, no parking meters.
We still don't have any parking meters. Well, kind of.
And the other thing that hit me right away was everybody that I encountered. I was having car trouble, and the mechanic was so friendly. And then I went up for dinner at a restaurant called the Jolly Tiger.
Mm-hmm.
And the waitress was so friendly. Everybody was really very friendly. And so I drove around, and I noticed that there was a brand new building on the corner of State and Korea called the Crocker Anglo Bank.
Mm.
And it had a big sign up there that the architects were Art Mosher Grant. And so that was my first contact. I said, in the morning, that's where I'm gonna go first to look for a job. And it was a grilled, I don't know, you probably don't remember, but in 1960, 1961, grills were very, very popular in modern architecture. An architect by the name of Stone, Edmund Durrell Stone or something like that. He did these grilled buildings, and they were very popular. And so Art Mosher Grant, being up with all of the popularities of contemporary architecture, had done a huge grilled building there for the bank. And then it got eventually it got remodeled into Saks Fifth Avenue, and a little more appropriate to Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And then Brian Cornell remodeled it again. I think Amazon's there now.
Yeah, I believe so.
It's a very good demonstration of how modern buildings in Santa Barbara evolved into Spanish buildings.
Mm.
And I've noticed that my first big project when I opened my own office was the ice patch on
right up here
on Cliff Drive. And that was a contemporary building. I thought ice patch should be a contemporary building, but you can see it's gotten remodeled into a Spanish building. And I don't know if you remember, Five Points used to be contemporary architecture with folded plates.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all Spanish now. De Loretta Plaza was all kind of nothing architecture, and now it's all Spanish. So there's an evolution of what happens in Santa Barbara. The young guys, they do contemporary architecture, and then eventually it evolves. So
what I call a facadomy.
A what?
A facadomy.
Yeah, right. So, but anyway, I went to Art Mosher Grant that first morning, and I talked to Glenn Mosher. He was not hiring, but he said, you know what you should do is you should go over and talk to Bob Hoyt. He knows everything that's going on in town, and he can give you some good directions. And so, and he gave me his address over on Chapala Street, right next to the Santa Barbara Club. And I went over there, and Mr. Hoyt was not there in the office, but I spoke to his chief draftsman, Carol Smith, who another very lovely, wonderful, friendly person. And he sat down, he said, Mr. Hoyt won't be into the office until about 4 o'clock, but here are some other places you should go. And he gave me the list of architects that he thought might be hiring and their addresses. And I went to Bill Hall. He eventually became Hall and Bicioni.
Mm-hmm.
He had was upstairs office right on the corner of De La Guerra and State Street, which has now become the plaza for Paseo Nuevo. it up to the second story. In fact,
Is that the one
Brian-
Cornell's doing
Brian
into a
Cornell's
hotel?
putting a third story on that
Yeah,
right now. You're reviewing it.
Yeah.
He was not hiring, but he was very friendly. And then I went out to Ken Kruger to interview Ken Kruger. He had an office out on State Street, Upper State Street, where I think all those new condominiums are being built now. There used to be a motel there that had a horse out in front, a structure of a horse. Do you remember that?
Yep.
Well, they had a few of their places were rented out as offices, and he had an office there. And so I talked to him. He was not hiring either, but very friendly and very nice. And so then it was almost lunchtime. I went back to the Jolly Tiger for lunch. and then I after lunch, I went to see Chet Carjola. And Chet Carjola had a partner of Frank Greer at the time. In fact, I think Chet was about ready to retire, but and he wasn't there. But Frank Greer was there after lunch, and so I would interview him. And I had this big portfolio of drawings that I'd done in architectural school, and I put them out on the desk, and I was showing him this and showing him that, and talking and doing all the talking and everything. And suddenly I looked up at him, and he was asleep in his chair. Frank was a 3 martini lunch guy. And I just put everything together and got up and walked out of there quietly. And anyway, so then I still had one more architect, Luda Riggs, and I had a hard time finding her house out in Montecito. I was not familiar with Santa Barbara, but I finally found her house, and I went in, and she had a secretary there, and I said, I'm interviewing for employment, and she said, well, you'll have to talk to Miss Riggs. And so I waited, and then finally they let me into her office. She was down on her hands and knees, and she had this big drawing down on the floor. I don't know why. I didn't ever ask why. Why are you on the floor at a drafting table? And she interviewed me while she was down there on the floor on her hands and knees. And that was the first person that I ran into that I didn't think was really friendly. It was a little on the rude side, and I think she felt I was intruding.
She didn't have time for you.
She didn't have time for me. And so that was the end of that. And so I only had one place left to go, and that was Bob Hoyt's. And when I went back to Bob Hoyt's at 4 o'clock, he was there. We also got down on the floor. He and put my portfolio out there. And the first thing he asked me was, he said, are you related to Alfred Thayer Mahan? He was in the Navy in the Second World War. And so he was a Navy guy, and so he knew about Alfred Thayer Mahan. In fact, at Annapolis, there is a huge building called the Alfred Thayer Mahan Memorial Building or something like that. But he said, are you related to Alfred Thayer Mahan? And I said, who's that? I'm sorry, I was in the Army. I didn't know about Navy people. I wished I would have. And I would have said, of course I'm related to him.
He's my great uncle.
Yeah, right. I probably am related to him. But anyway, so Bob, and we looked at all the drawings, and we talked a lot. And Bob said, okay, he said, I'm going to hire you. So I got hired the first day. And I know I was really lucky. And so I said, I've got to go. I've got a wife back in Iowa. I've got to go and move out here. And so a couple of weeks, and he said, okay, I think I started work in July with Hoyt. And we rented an apartment on Cliff Drive in Barranca. There on the southeast corner of Cliff Drive in Barranca. Do you know where that is? Right down the street there. Second story, a little 1-bedroom apartment. Our housing at Iowa State was $15 a month, and that was student housing. But if you would have rented a regular apartment in Ames, which was a very, very nice town and very, very busy. I mean, the university there was never very much available to rent, but you could rent a nice apartment for $35, $40 a month. The apartment on Cliff Drive was $110 a month. It really hit us hard. I didn't, and so I understand when the young people talk about housing in Santa Barbara and how expensive it is and how unavailable it is. It was that way when I came.
Yeah.
And we stayed there for a couple, 3 months. I wanted to be close to the ocean, but I realized after a couple, 3 months that we couldn't afford that. And so we found a little duplex up by Cottage Hospital that wasn't as nice and as modern. And we moved there, and it was $85 a month. It was still pretty expensive, but not quite as bad. It was owned by Pearl Chase's brother,
Harold.
and where the Chase Bar and Grill is now, that's where I used to go to pay my rent. And that makes me to think about State Street. And State Street was really not very exciting. It was not a very exciting, downtown Santa Barbara was not very exciting. I didn't even notice the nice Spanish buildings. There were cars parked along State Street. The sidewalks were very narrow, maybe 12 feet wide. And then Pearl Chase, because there was no planting in the sidewalk, she decided that she would provide big concrete pots with a palm tree in them, and they were along, every 100 feet or something like that, which just made it even worse in terms of the. It was just not very exciting, and the parking was, I think it was parallel parking, and it was inconvenient. The stores were old-fashioned, folksy, Ott's. The big store downtown was Ott's, which was kind of the general store, and there was a penny store, there was a Morgan, there was a Montgomery Ward's, but it was not a very exciting downtown. And if you went on State Street, when you got to San Roque, that was the end of town, and it's the orchards started. Orchards all the way from San Roque, all the way out to Old Town Goleta. And there was there was a little store at the corner of La Cumbra and State Street called Kelly's Corners, and they did groceries and stuff like that. But other than that, it was all those tracks just came out of nowhere all of a sudden, and they by the time, by 6 or 8 years later, I mean, Goleta existed and was everything. The university was there, UCSB was there, and I think that's what initiated the growth. But so the Santa Barbara was not very exciting in terms of a downtown, and until the parking district, once they decided to do the parking districts and get this parking off of State Street, that started to change things. And then of course the plaza, State Street Plaza, really made a difference. I think it hasn't evolved into something so nice now. It's chaotic now, but maybe that will find its own way out. So that's, and another thing that in the early 60s, there were practically no restaurants in Santa Barbara. There was the best restaurant in Santa Barbara was called Talk of the Town. It was on Gutierrez Street, West Gutierrez Street, and it was a nice restaurant. It was a steakhouse. When you came in the door, there were a bunch of ties hanging on a hook, and everybody wore a tie in there.
So if you didn't have a tie, you got one off the hook?
You didn't get in. You put one on. And I think that's the way it still is at the Little Town Club. And I thought that was nice. And Sevilla, there was the Sevillas was on Chapala Street, that was still there. There was another restaurant up in La Arcada called El Cielito, which was down a little in terms of quality and price. But that was it, about 3 restaurants. And now, when you think about restaurants in Santa Barbara, including Coast Village Road and Montecito, I mean, it's just wonderful, wonderful places to eat. But
Yeah.
then there were only a few places. Well, that's the way it was.
You mentioned Iowa. Were you born in Iowa?
Born in Iowa? Yes,
Where were you
I was
born?
I was born in Iowa, but I did live I lived for a couple of years in Los Angeles during the Second World War, and so I did know a little bit about California. And when I got out of high school, 1961. Let me make sure. 1951. I got out of college in 1961. 1951, I got out of college and I worked at the penny store for a while. I didn't have money. I didn't have any money, and I didn't have anybody to put me through college. And I worked at the penny store. And then I got drafted. The Korean War was on, and I got drafted 2 years. I had a really good time in the Army. I liked the Army. I was in the quartermaster. I mean, I'd been in the penny store, so I got into the quartermaster. The Army, they're not as dumb as you think they are. They could see that I wasn't infantry quality. You got to be an athlete to be in infantry. Yeah. So, well, I did my 2 years, and then I had a GI Bill. And at that time, when I was in the Army, that's when I decided that I wanted to be an architect and study architecture. And
what inspired you to make that decision? What inspired you to make that decision?
What caused me to make that?
Yeah. What was there something that inspired you to?
Well, I remember starting to think about a house, and I started to draw when I was at the penny store, and I was down in the shoe department, shoe salesman, and when there wasn't anything to do, I would go back there and I would pull a box of shoes down and I would start drawing on top of the cover, and I remember planning a house. I didn't have, I lived in a little apartment, and before that, when I was in high school, I lived with my grandmother. I hadn't really had a home of my own, and that seemed to be important. And I started doing houses, and that got me thinking about architecture. When I was in the Army, I read The Fountainhead, and that was, I mean, I know it's a silly book now, but when you're young, it really hit me, and I like that very much. And then there was another. Life magazine used to do an article once a week. They would do an article on a profession. What is it like to be a pharmacist? What is it like to be a obstetrician? What is it like to be an insurance salesman? And one of the magazines, it said, what is it like to be an architect? And I remember reading that article, what it was like to be an architect, and I said, that's what I want to be. And then I never changed from that. So, and Iowa State was, I think I got a wonderful education at Iowa State. And after my 4th year, when my GI Bill was running out, I dropped out of school for a year, and I went down to Des Moines and got a job at an architectural firm so I could earn some money to get through that 5th year. And I happened to be hired by one of the best architects in Iowa, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful tutorial for me to work in that office under actually there were 2 architects that were really, the one, Chick Herbert, got an FAIA in design. He was the best architect in Iowa, and his partner, or he never had a partner, but his buddy was John Locke, was just a wonderful, wonderful mentor. He taught me so much. And then when my year was up and I had some money back in my pocket, I went back and I finished my 5th year, and it was a brutal winter of 61. And I was president of the student body, not student body, president of the student chapter of the AIA when I was in my 5th year. And the university decided that they would send me out to the national convention in San Francisco in March. It was a brutal March in Iowa, and I drove out to California.
Sunny California.
When I came down out of Tahoe and down into those rolling green hills that lead into San Francisco, and I thought, oh my God, this is heaven on earth. And I was put up at one of the fraternity houses, took me in, and they were so friendly and so nice, and they took me to Chinese food, and it was just, I thought, boy, this is I like it. I like California. And then I happened to hit this magazine that had this big article about Santa Barbara in a leisure magazine. And I read about Santa Barbara, and I really wanted to go to a smaller town. I didn't want to go to San Francisco or Los Angeles. I wanted to go to a smaller town, work in a smaller office where you really get good experience.
You don't get lost.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Bob Hoyt right away, he gave me design responsibility, and I was doing houses and stuff, designing stuff. Bob was a really good mentor, also very good mentor, but he was a difficult person. He'd grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut. Have you been to Greenwich, Connecticut? It's the Montecito of Manhattan.
We left off talking about when you got involved with AIA.
Yeah, I wanted to back up a little bit.
All right.
And I'm glad we took a break, because it gave me a chance to think about things that I hadn't talked about. And I wanted to go back and talk about the Spanish architecture when I came to Santa Barbara.
Yes.
And right out of college, and of course, a modernist, as all college people were after the Second World War. And I came to Santa Barbara, and of course, it was Spanish. But as I think about it now, I really didn't notice it too much. It was here, and it was done, and it was fine. But not what I was going to do. I was going to do modern architecture, because that's what I was taught to do.
Was the historic district formed at that point?
There was a historic district, but it was very quiet. Nothing was happening in the historic district. In fact, when I think about Santa Barbara in 1961, not very much was happening anywhere. There was the big Crocker Angle Bank that I mentioned on the corner of Carrillo and State Street, and a few other maybe smaller buildings. But mostly not too much was being done at that time. It was fairly quiet. And that's why there were only 6 or 7 architectural firms. Now there are 50 or 60.
Yeah.
But the Robert Engel Hoyt, who went to school in the 30s, so he had a traditional education. And then when he came to Santa Barbara, of course, he was a modernist. And he liked to do modern architecture, but he was sensitive to traditional architecture too. And he took me out to show me what he thought was good. He took me to the Arlington Theater. I was very, very impressed by the interior of the Arlington Theater. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. He took me to the courthouse. I was overwhelmed by it. I just was overwhelmed by it. It was just so much.
Yeah.
And then he took me to El Paseo. And we entered in through the Street of Spain. There used to be big awnings that used to go across. Now there are flags.
Yeah.
But there used to be awnings that went across, and I was very impressed by those awnings for some reason. And then we came into the patio, and it was very vibrant. There was a little restaurant there that served breakfast and lunch. And it was a magnet for people downtown. They all came, and they were all there, and their tables, umbrellas. The whole patio was full of people.
And no roof.
No, I'm not talking about the restaurant. I'm talking about the open patio.
Okay.
Was full of people, full of tables, umbrellas,
Hmm.
of people drinking and eating and connecting. I'd never seen anything like that before. That something that was so vibrant and so attractive to I just hadn't seen anything like that in Iowa. And of course, Iowa doesn't have patios because of the winter.
Yeah.
So, but the architecture itself, which now I believe is amongst the most beautiful architecture in Santa Barbara. I hardly noticed it because it's so simple. And less is, there's less is more. It's really very, very simple architecture. But I noticed very much the vibrance of the patio. And so we weren't doing Spanish architecture. Nobody was doing Spanish architecture at the time. But in maybe 64 or 65, Hoyt got the commission to do the historical museum. And while he tended to give me most of the design, I was the designer in his office, and he was the reviewer. But he took that museum on and designed it himself. He probably thought nobody could do a really Spanish building, and they were going to, the board there wanted a really Spanish building. And so he designed that himself. I think it's one of the great pieces of new architecture in Santa Barbara since the Second World War. And I would never have been able to do it like he did it. It's just gorgeous. It's just beautiful. And there's a kind of a funny story about it because as they were building it, it's reinforced concrete with a veneer of adobe. And
it's concrete adobe, isn't it? Faux adobe, or is it real?
It's real adobe, but just a veneer.
Yeah.
And Elmer Whitaker lived in one of the old haciendas that became part of the Presidio. The west wing of the Presidio was the original Whitaker adobe. They called it Whitaker adobe, and that's where he lived. And before they built the Presidio.
Is that on the corner of?
It's on Cantor Perdido Street, but it's not on the corner. It's when you go into the office there, I think the first place you go in, the first door you go into is the old Whitaker adobe. Then they added on to that, and then they did the chapel. So he was very much into Spanish architecture. And he thought that the museum should have buttresses because he thought that would be very beautiful. Bob Hoyt said it doesn't need buttresses. And Bob was very much, he was right. I mean, he was right. It didn't need buttresses, so don't put buttresses on it. And a little bit, that's kind of a modernist approach. We don't decorate our buildings with stuff that they don't need.
Yeah.
Elmer Whitaker was the chairman, or he was a man of power on the board. He said, we're going to have buttresses. And Bob said, we're not going to have buttresses. And they got in this big argument. And finally, the building was almost done, but they resigned. He resigned as architect, and Elmer Whitaker put the buttresses on. They're on there. I think
Is that what faces Santa Barbara Street?
Yeah,
you see
on De La Guerra.
You see them marching along there.
Yeah, De La Guerra Street. And I think the buttresses are quite nice, but they weren't necessary. But anyway, it's a very beautiful building. And that was really the first, I think, since the Second World War, that was the first really authentic Spanish colonial revival building in downtown Santa Fe. It was in the historic district, so it had to be that way. There was a advisory committee that the city council had set up just before I came to Santa Fe, I think in 1960. And they advised, but they had no power. And then around maybe it was 66 or 68, sometime in that, the city council changed that and made it they gave it a little more power. It became the Historic Landmarks Committee. And it had some good, Bob was on it, Luda Riggs was on it. Eventually, Dr. Gebhardt came on it. When he came on it, he was a powerhouse. And it started to change and become very powerful. And when they still weren't doing very many Spanish buildings, and I was saying like in 1969 when I did design the parking structure behind the library, I don't think of that as a Spanish building, although it's got some Spanish decoration. I think of it as a postmodern building. It's a modern parking structure with some corbels, so a little bit of tile, tile mansard, which is not Spanish. That's French. Anyway, but we were drifting. We were drifting that way, and Bob really was a leader with the museum. That was really the first building. And in 1975, I opened up my own office in 71. And my first big project was the ice patch, which was a contemporary. I did a contemporary building. I think I told you that the owners wanted to do a Spanish building, and I resisted that. They said you can't do a Spanish building. First of all, Cliff Drive is not El Pueblo Viejo.
And it's practically out of town.
Yeah, and the ABR, which reviewed it, they liked it very much. It's appropriate. But in 1975, I did the building called the Carrillo Garden Building. It's a Monterey style building on the
Garden and
Carrillo Street, across from the big 3-story Michael Tobes building. That was the first really Spanish building that I designed, and it got a Santa Barbara Beautiful Award. And a telephone call from your predecessor, Jack Dewey, who I didn't know at the time. He called me up and he said, "Bill," he said, "I just wanted to tell you that's the nicest building that's been done." And I think that was also maybe the second or third Spanish building, but we were starting to move away from modern architecture in the 70s and move back into Spanish buildings. I talked to a lot of my colleagues, Brian Cornell and Fred Sweeney and Ed Lindvik, and they all started doing Spanish buildings in the 80s, but they weren't here in the 70s. And so that's kind of I wanted to talk about the evolution from modern back to Spanish architecture. And then what happened with David Gebhardt, Dr. Gebhardt, with the Historic Landmarks Committee, it became more powerful and more powerful and more powerful. And I came on the ABR in 1983, and I became chair, I think, in 1986. And by that time, all of the buildings in the El Pueblo Viejo were getting double review. David Gebhardt's committee, the Historic Landmarks Committee, and the ABR. Of course, we had the power, and he didn't have the power. We were charter, and he wasn't, but he was powerful. And they didn't agree with ABR, and the committee didn't agree. Because
of two different focuses or something?
And the applicants were going crazy. They were going crazy with this. And I got together with David and I said, David, this is not good for design review. We've got to be on the same page. And he said, I don't see how we can ever do that, because you guys see it one way and we see it another way. I said, I think what we're gonna have to do is divide the city up. Your committee take downtown Santa Barbara, and we'll take everything outside of El Pueblo Viejo. And that's when we split, and we went to city council, and they made the Historic Landmarks Committee, the Historic Landmarks Commission, and put it into the charter. And at the same time, David expanded the El Pueblo Viejo tremendously to across State Street, to the west side of State Street, clear down to Cabrillo and along Cabrillo and up to the Mission. So El Pueblo Viejo is really big now. It used to be just 16 blocks. And that's how that committee became a commission, and that's how we divided Santa Barbara up. We just had to do it that way. And so that's a little bit of history that I think is important, and I wanted to get that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now we can go to ABR if you'd like.
Yeah. What started your involvement, from the obvious of being a professional? What started your involvement with AIA?
I joined the AIA when I was a student. We had a student chapter at Iowa State. I joined it when I was a freshman, and I was active. We weren't too active, but we'd go down to Des Moines and when they had their convention and once a year and show some of our drawings and stuff like that. But anyway, by the time I was my fifth year, I got elected as president of the student chapter. And the university decided to send me to the national convention, which was in San Francisco. That's when I first got the California bug. I drove out in I think it was March, horrible winter in Iowa. I get this magazine called Our Iowa. And there's always some history about the past in there. And I was reading about it. And the 1961 winter was one of the worst winters. Anyway, I drove out to San Francisco. And when I hit those hills, those green hills coming into San Francisco, I was mesmerized. And I thought, boy, oh boy, when I graduate, I'm coming to California. And I happened to run into before I get into that. So we had the convention was in San Francisco. I stayed at a fraternity house. The School of Architecture, the students there were wonderful, very, very friendly. They took me to Chinese food and everything. It was just a really great experience. California was really a great experience. But when I got back to Iowa, I happened to see in a magazine article, an article about Santa Barbara. And I read it, and it sounded Santa Barbara. I'd never been to Santa Barbara, but it sounded really good. And I told my former wife, I said, we're going to move to Santa Barbara, and I'm going to try to get a job there. So I did. Of course, Bob Hoyt was an AIA member, and Carol Smith, who was the chief draftsman for Bob Hoyt, was an honorary AIA. He was not licensed as an architect, but he was an honorary AIA. And he took me to my first AIA meeting, which was over on San Andreas Street. I think there was a little house there that the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts used. It was kind of a community center on San Andreas Street somewhere. And that's where the AIA had their meetings. And they're not very big meetings. I mean, there were maybe 10 or 15 people at the most.
And that was the whole chapter.
That was the whole chapter. But it was very cliquish. All of the Cal Poly guys, I'm talking about the young architects who were not architects yet, but were associate architects. The Cal Poly guys they all had their table. The USC, they had a table. The Berkeley had a little table. There weren't too many of them. They were all very cliquish. And, I was from Iowa.
Iowa had their own table.
Yeah, and it was just one person. Well, Carol Smith was there. I used to always go with him. Bob didn't. Once in a while, Bob would go to AIA meetings, and he was always a needle, and he would always be interrupting, and something was not, a point of order. He was very, anyway. So I didn't integrate very well because it was cliquish, and that was a problem. I kind of drifted. I mean, I stayed a member, and I paid my dues, which were practically nothing. But I really didn't get involved with the AIA here until 78. Yeah, 78. Make sure of my dates.
Because you were president in 79?
I'm just thinking, was it 79 or 89?
I think it was 79.
Yeah, 79. Yeah, it was 79. 78, Peter Edwards was president. And Peter Edwards was also, Peter Edwards didn't go to architectural school. His father was William Edwards of Edwards and Plunkett. His father-in-law was Kem Weber, the Bauhaus architect. So, he had
heritage.
He didn't have to go to school. But anyway, he was kind of an outlander like I was. But he had gotten appointed president, and he asked me to be vice president. To be secretary. Well, that brought me out of the cold, and so I came in and I started getting involved in the chapter, and I was the secretary and he was the president. And I don't remember who vice president and treasurers were at the time. But anyway, we went into one of our many recessions, and by the end of my year as secretary, both the vice president and the treasurer left town and moved to San Diego. And Peter called me up and he says, Bill, he said, you know what's happened? He says, you're going to be president next year. And so I jumped from.
Skip to the front of the line.
I skipped to the front of the line. At the time, they didn't have an office. They didn't have anything like that. And every year, AIA had a different phone number because the phone number would be the president's phone number. And I thought, this is crazy. And then I found out that they had $20,000 in the bank. They'd been hoarding all this money. I said to the board, I said, what are we doing? What are we doing with this money? Nothing. We're just accumulating it, I said, no, that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to forward architecture. And I said, we need an office to do that. We need a phone number. We need a real, we need a secretary. We need somebody to answer the
presence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we've got the money to do it, but I said, that's what we're going to do. And we rented this little place, a little porch on the back of the adobe that's next to the Libero building toward the post office. There's a little adobe there. It's a brick building. And on the back, there was this crummy little porch, but they would rent it out. And that's where we rented that out. And I got a secretary, part-time. She would come in, eventually Jill Yeoman, but before Jill Yeoman, I got a secretary. We got our own phone number, and we established an office and
put the AIA flag in the dirt, as it were.
Exactly. And I think that made a lot of difference for the chapter. And then eventually I hired Jill Yeoman. I don't know if I hired Jill Yeoman or who followed me. I'm trying to think of who did follow me. I believe it was Steve Mitch. And he hired Jill Yeoman, and Jill Yeoman was really, at first she was very, very good and very positive and very active, and she got new members coming in, and she got everything. And then we got a bigger office. I think we eventually moved over to Barry Burkus's office on Delegara Street in Santa Barbara.
I think that's where I ran into her.
Yeah,
when I was working for Barry.
Yeah, and we just was, and then of course the Pierre Clayson came into the picture, and I believe it was Ed Ledvick was president at the time, and he picked up the phone and it was Pierre, and Pierre said, you guys need a real office. You need your own home. And I've got $500,000 here. I'm going to give it to you to buy a home. And Ed appointed myself and John Pittman, the three of us, as a committee to look for a building. And John, John was the Gary Cooper of the chapter. No compromise, absolutely no compromise. And he thought we should have a Spanish building. Well, you can't buy a Spanish building in downtown Santa Barbara for $500,000, or maybe even $1 million. Even at that time, this is back in, I don't remember when, 80.
Yeah, early 80s, I think.
Yeah, early
2
80s.
or 3, somewhere in there.
But so we putzed around, and we didn't do anything. And John was adamant. And finally, I got with Ed, and I said, Ed, we're going to have to outvote John. We got the Atchison house was up for sale. We looked at that, and I said, this is a good. It was 650,000, I think, or something like that. I said, but that's pretty close. And I said, I think Pierre will come across with the extra money, and he did. And so we said to John, John, we're going to buy the Atchison house, and John, he gave in, which the one time in his life. And
pained him to do it.
So we went back to Pierre, or I guess Ed went back to Pierre and said, we need 650,000. It's an Atchison house. You should go take a look at it. And Pierre said, okay, that's fine. And so we got the Atchison house. And then Pierre said, I'm going to give you another 500,000. Ed, I think, wanted to do some of that and went into scholarship. And some of it was supposed to be put aside for the maintenance of the house. And at first, Ed assigned me to take care of to invest the money, that extra 500,000, and I invested it in stock, and we were doing it had been in bonds. And we sold all the bonds and we had this cash, and I invested it in stocks, and we were doing pretty well. And then the lawyers came and they said, wait a minute, this is a foundation. You can't invest your own money. You've got to have, an account executive invest in it. And so an account executive took it over, and then we lost some money. But anyway, so that was it. I was on the board. I was on the board when we established the foundation, and we had Atchison House already, but Fred Sweeney was the president at the time. Following, I was still on the board, and Fred Sweeney said, we need to do a foundation so that people can give money and there'd be tax advantage to it, and so we established the foundation, and that took over and owned the house. And for a while, the foundation was very, very good, but then it drifted off. Well, it got membership that was not AIA. And so it kind of drifted off, and it's on its own, in its own trajectory. And I think the AIA is we have our own foundation now, right?
Yeah, a trust.
Yeah, and so that was kind of the way that went. And then, of course, after you leave the board, I was on the state Cal AIA board member for a number of years. I was also did stuff for the architectural board. We met one time up in Monterey and reviewed 300 designs, 300 designs for the exam. And I need to go back and talk about the exam, but it was interesting. You're looking at all these different solutions, and in the end, there was really only 3 solutions. It turned out that out of 300, 100 had pretty close to the same solution. I mean, they were different in certain ways, but they were pretty much the same. And then there was solution B and there was solution C, and those were all acceptable. And then there was solution D failed, and E failed. I thought that was kind of interesting. There weren't innumerable solutions. There were only those 3. But I want to go back about my own, when I was at Bob Hoyt's, and I decided that it was time to get my license. And so I started studying, and I studied, and the exam is 5 days. There are 2 tests the first day, 2 tests the second day, 2 tests the third day, 2 tests the fourth day, and then the 5th was design. That was all day. And I thought, the design will be the only one that I'll pass. I don't know about the rest of them. And when I got my letter from the state board, they said, you passed all of your tests except for the design.
It was the other way around.
I couldn't believe it. I must have left the room off or something. I don't know what I did that was wrong, but something was wrong. But the next time
solution D.
The next time that I went down, then 6 months later, I was so prepared for that design. One thing I did the first time was I didn't schedule myself well. I got behind. So that when I went down the second time, I had a schedule. You start at 8 o'clock, and at 9:30 you're through with schematics, and you move on, and you eat lunch here. 15 minutes for lunch, and I had it all planned out. And so then I got my anyway. So then we went for our oral exam, which was down in Los Angeles. And I remember sitting with all of these fellows and and I went in to this guy, and just one person there for an oral exam. And he said, "Now, who have you been working for?" And I said, "Robert Ingle Hoyt." He said, "Oh, Bob Hoyt." He said, "I know him. He's a real character, isn't he?" And yeah, he is a real character. We just talked about Bob Hoyt. He said, "I can tell that you're ready to be licensed."
Pass.
And I went out and I shook hands with everybody, and everybody's hand was really sweaty, and so was mine. But that's how I got I had my license, and that was good. So that was kind of then after I had done my stuff up in Sacramento, and stuff for the board, architectural board, I kind of dropped out of AIA, and I think that's what people do as they get older. The young guys come along and they take over and they do it, and that's fine. And until FAIA, I really wasn't too involved anymore with AIA business. And FAIA was a great, wonderful experience, and I mean everybody feels that way, and so I'm very proud about that, and I thank you. I know you helped me a lot.
Yeah, extraordinary career.
I speaking of FAIA, I was the chapter. They decided that we hadn't had any FAIAs. Bob Hoyt got his FAIA, and then that was about it. Nobody was getting any FAIAs, and they weren't even trying. And
I think he got his in 80. I want to say 83.
Bob?
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. So the board said, Leonard Hager, who was a professor at Cal Poly, he moved down to Santa Barbara, and everybody, they said, Leonard Hager, I think he could be a FAIA. We should encourage him to try to be a FAIA. And they said, "Bill, why don't you become his, what do you call it, your sponsor?"
Yeah.
I sponsored it. So we had lunch, and I said, "Well, I didn't know him from Adam. I didn't go to Cal Poly, but almost all of the Cal Poly guys knew him, And I said, "Well, Mr. Professor Hager," I said, what do you think, what can we talk about, for your FAIA?" And he said, "When I was in the Navy," he said, I invented the Quonset hut." I said, "You invented the Quonset hut?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "That's what I did when I was in the Navy." And he said, "Then when I got out of the Navy," he said, "I went to work for this big development company back in Pennsylvania, and they were doing houses, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses." And he said, I invented the plumbing tree." I said, "You did the Quonset hut and the plumbing tree? No problem." And there was no problem. He got FAIA. And of course, and then he said, "That wasn't it. Also," he said, I was at Washington, D.C., and he said, I was at some agency of the government. And he said, we got to give out a lot of money. And he said, I was giving money to the architectural schools all over the country." And I said, "You're going to be FAIA." And he made it. And then I sponsored Ken Kruger, who also made it. I may have done Ken Kruger first. I don't remember. Ken Kruger went on a tour, an AIA. I think it was an AIA tour of China, and he met all of these and got really friendly with all of these architects from all over the country, and a lot of them were FAIAs, and they thought Ken should be an FAIA, and Ken never became a traditionalist, with the exception of the mission. He put an addition on the mission, and it's a beautiful addition. It's just perfect. You don't know where the old mission ends and the new mission on that wing that comes off of the church. But other than that, I don't think Ken ever did a traditional building. Right now, his firm has changed. They've changed now. He's gone, of course, and I think they do traditional work now if they get the opportunity. But Ken never did any. It was always modern work. But he got his FAIA, and I think he deserved it. He was a fine architect. And John Pittman, then I think, was the next one. who got FAIA. And I don't remember who was John Pittman's sponsor. John and I were friends then. We weren't as close. Eventually, John and I became really close friends. And he worked with me on some stuff over at Ojai when I did some of my Ojai work. I really liked John so much, and we worked together really well after Peter left and retired. But I don't remember who sponsored John, but he got his FAIA. And then I don't think anybody got FAIA until
Holiday.
And that was a long
Time.
There were 10 or
I think John got it in 88. I want to say 88 or late 80s.
87, 80, 88, 80, yeah.
And then Holiday got it in 2012.
Yeah. And it was a second try.
That's a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's been quite a few since then,
Yeah.
I think.
Dennis Thompson, Cass Innsberg.
Yeah. And then me.
Mhm.
And then I don't think somebody since me, there hasn't been anybody else.
They're trying though.
What?
They're trying. Joe,
They're trying, but
yeah, they're trying.
Yeah. I was very surprised that Bob Kubiak didn't make it.
Yeah, I was too.
I think that he needs to have. I know he's qualified.
Yeah.
He should be, and it's just that he didn't do the right report.
Yeah.
Didn't do it right.
The storytelling.
Yeah. Well, that's about it for the AIA. About my only connection now is I try to go to the gala every year,
Mhm.
and that's important. I contribute to the foundation that you've established, and I think that's important. And I'm disappointed in the design of, what do they call it, that they have at the end of the year?
The design awards.
Yeah, the
effort.
design awards. It really doesn't reflect Santa Barbara. It reflects contemporary houses that are done out in Montecito, and the whoever judges it is somebody from LA or Las Vegas or somewhere, and they really aren't in touch with Santa Barbara. I think that's unfortunate, and it doesn't really communicate to the community what AIA should be more responsive to our local
local effort. Yeah, I agree.
And I think that's unfortunate. But other than that, the gala is a very nice function. I'm really well attended, and I'm really pleased to see so many young people involved with the chapter, and it's important. It's wonderful.
From 14 to 140.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
So we used to, the chapter was so small, actually, when I first came here, that we had Ventura and Santa Maria, city of Santa Maria. I think the whole county was in our chapter, plus this county of Ventura.
And then I think at some point they split.
Pardon me?
I think at some point they split.
Oh, yeah, they did. They split. Yeah. I don't remember just exactly when that happened. When I was president, which was in 60, what would we say? 79. And I went back to the convention in Kansas City, and a fellow was running for the to be national president, and he was from Iowa. And he found out I was from Iowa, and he said, "Bill," he said, "you've got to support me." I said, "Well," I said, I'll support you on the first vote, but I don't know if I can support you, you know." And he said, "So how many votes do you have?" Well, I had votes from Santa Barbara and I had votes from Ventura. And it turns out that I had more votes than the state of Iowa. I gave him my first vote, but I could see he was not going to make it. The politics and the national politics is, you know, the big cities control.
It's not any better now.
Yeah, no. In fact, it's worse because I think it used to be more state. Each state had some control, some autonomy, and that's all been mushed together. I think actually when John Pittman got his FAI and the others, Leonard Hager and Ken Kruger, pretty much FAI was decided in Sacramento. And now it's very much national.
Yeah.
And so, you know, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, they're just they're powerhouses. And if you come from Santa Barbara chapter, you're just nothing. That's just politics.
In your body of work, does any particular project you did stand out among?
I think the project that I'm proudest of is the spa at the Ojai Valley Inn. That was a big building, a complicated building where, you know, people come into the lobby and the men go one way and the women go the other way, and you got to have all of these facilities separated, and then they go upstairs to the spa where they get massages, and then on the third floor there were these very, very exclusive apartments of hotel rooms. It was, and then the wings that came out. That, you know, there's I don't know if you've been over there to it. You know, it's got a big patio in front with a fountain in the middle, and you know, there was a dance studio or a gymnasium on one side, and some other little shops on the other side, and it was a complicated building to design. I had a really good spa consultant working with me, a lady who really knew the spa business, and so I'm very, very proud of that. I think architecturally it comes off. It's a big building, but I think it comes off as a Spanish colonial revival building. So I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of, although it's not a Spanish building, but I'm very, very proud of the parking structure behind the library. And a lot of people tell me it's the best parking structure in town. You go in, you get the first stall that's available, and you get out fast. And
We call it the Rolodex,
but
because of the spiral exit.
That's right. And I wanted to do that again down in the Libero. When the parking district, the last garage was going to be behind the Santa Barbara Bank and Trust, and I wanted to do a similar building where you come in off of Anacapa, or you could come in off of Canon Perdido the same way, you know, like Figueroa and Anacapa, and you'd have the spiral ramp down, but the El Centro building was in the way. And I was still ruthless enough that I would take the El Centro building out for the parking structure. Now, the El Centro building, I would fight tooth and nail to save that building.
Yeah.
And so we change as we mature. But so we had to do it's a hermaphrodite of a building. You know, you have a ramp that goes into the second floor. You have a ramp that goes up on top. Then there's another ramp that comes in kind of behind the theater. So it's all fragmented and it doesn't really work well together. But that was the best design I could do. Bob Hoyt did the architecture. I did the layout. And I think architecturally it's successful. From a functional standpoint as a parking structure, I don't think it's too good.
Yeah.
I think the other two parking structures, the one down on Ortega Street is pretty functional, and the one that up the Libero, no, the Granada garage, you know, that's pretty functional. When I did the parking structure, both of those parking structures, we didn't have mechanical. We weren't going to do mechanical ventilation. So they had to be really open. And when they're really open, it's hard to have a really open building look like a Spanish building. The Granada building has mechanical ventilation. And Henry, who did wrap the architecture around it, I think did a beautiful job.
Mhm.
It's very Hispanic
Yeah.
and very successful. But that was possible because of the mechanical ventilation, and you could have offices and you could have, walls. Spanish architecture is more wall and less window.
Mhm.
So another building that I'm very proud of, although I was not the designer, and that's the Greek church. Gilberry was the architect. I think that I'm trying to think of his name, Mike Pecos. Mike Pecos was a landscape architect, and he was a city parks director, and then he was county parks director, and he was the head of the design team out at the Greek church, St. Barbara's, and I believe that the architecture was very much controlled by him. Gilberry was the architect, but he got crossways with the Greeks, and you don't get crossways with the Greeks
And survive.
And then you say, I'm sorry. There's no forgiveness. And so they needed an architect of construction. And I became the architect of construction, and it was really a wonderful experience. The Greeks they were so involved with that church. It was a whole life, and I just couldn't get over how involved they were with it. And I don't know if you've been out to see it, but it is a beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Beautiful. Yeah. They gave everything for it, and the cross, by the way, that's on top. Well, first we had the cross was on the drawings, and the county building department said, it's over 40 feet. It's 42 feet because the cross is 2 feet tall or whatever, it's 30 inches. They said, you can't do it. You can't put it on there. And the Greeks sued them for the First Amendment, violation of the First Amendment. And they went to court, and I think it was Anderley, Judge Anderley. He said, this is a First Amendment violation. You will pay the attorney's fees, and you will pay for the cross. And he threw the book at the county. But anyway, I made that cross in my basement, and I had it gilded. I had it gilded down at one of the sign. I can't remember which sign painter gilded it with gold. And I got in the bucket of Romasanta. Mark Romasanta was the contractor. I got in the bucket with him, and we rode up there, and I put that cross on top of the cupola with my own hands. And I was so proud of that.
That's a great story.
But it was a wonderful experience in the Greeks. And another thing, it was the Greeks said, "Oh, Bill, you got to go to Greece. You got to go to, where should I go to Greece? Well, you want to go to Thessaloniki, or you want to go to Crete, or you want to go to." They all had some place they had to go. So finally, Nine and I, we went to Greece, and with two of our best friends went with us, and we rented a car. And we drove all over Greece. We drove clear to the south to the very tip of Peloponnesus, and we drove clear up to Thessaloniki. And we went over to Meteora, that's where they have these monasteries on top of these pinnacles, and we just went everywhere. And the roads are beautiful in Greece, and the signs are all in Greek and in English. The Greek people are very friendly. The young people all speak English. We had the best trip, and the food is. It's not Paris, but it was a wonderful trip. So I got back, and I said to my friend, he said, "Oh, you got to go to Crete." And we did go to Crete, actually. And I said, "Yeah, Crete's really great. And what do you think about, Meteora?" He said, "Meteora, where's that?" Well, I said, "What about Thessaloniki?" He said, "I've never been there. Just go to Crete. That's where my family is." And I found out that all these Greeks, they go to where their family is. And that's Greece to them. In the end, I knew more about Greece than they did. But they are wonderful people, and they are so friendly, and they are so involved in their church and their religion. I just couldn't get over it. Just was wonderful.
Well, as we wrap up, are there any concluding thoughts you have about the profession and or anything?
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about that I think is important, and that's design review.
Hmm.
I got on Don Sharp and I were partners. We became partners in 83. And Don was on ABR, but he moved, and he moved into the county. So he had to get off of ABR. And he said, Bill, and he only had like a year left. He said, Bill, he said, I think you should take my place. Why don't you take my place? And Don was always very much for architects being involved in government, you know, whether it's a planning commission or design review or whatever. You should do your part. And I said, well, I'll try. He said, I'll put in a good word for you, and so on and so forth. And of course, he knew everybody. And so I got appointed for a year, and on ABR. And this was we met in the old church on Chapala Street that now is the theater.
Oh, yeah.
City
planning was there.
Yeah, we used to meet there, and there were 9. There were 9 people on ABR. They've cut that down to 7 now. Only Historic Landmarks Commission is 9, but there used to be 9 people, and a lot of them were not architects. The city council at the time was kind of anti-architect. Most of the architects were for contemporary buildings, and the city council was for traditional architecture. So they had, like, Doug Bartoli was there were a couple of interior designers. There was Carol Kenyon was a restorer, art restorer.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't remember some of the other people that were on. So it was a very, very ecumenical commission or board, ABR, and we still smoked. We smoked at the table. Carol Kenyon smoked. She just smoked those brown cigarettes, and I smoked. I can't believe we smoked at the and they didn't have any. It was not very well organized. You just came in and sat down, and there was a sequence of, but there was no time certains or anything like that. You just waited, and I thought it was crazy. And so I don't remember who was chair. Well, Carol Kenyon was chair at first, and then Brian Cornell became chair. And then he moved to the county. I was vice chair, and he was chair, and he moved to the county. So then I became chair, and I said, we've got to change some things, and we need an agenda that's got time certains on it, and we need to try to stay, to not spend forever on a particular project. And we made a lot of changes, and I think for the better. And
was that in a way to kind of manage expectations so people wouldn't have to be waiting in the room all day long?
Exactly. When you had to come in. And that worked pretty well. And then I'm trying to think of, I think we moved when we left that place there, and I guess that's when we moved into the David Gebhardt room. But as I said earlier, I became chair like in 86, and in 89, David Gebhardt and we decided to split. The ABR and the Historic Landmarks Committee would become a commission in 89. So that happened about 89 or 9. I guess the city council didn't finalize that until in the 90s, 91 or 92. They had to put a referendum on the ballot to make that a charter commission, which they did, and also changed and expanded the Historic Landmarks, the El Pueblo Viejo district tremendously. So I was on. Actually, I served 3 terms plus a year. I was on for 13 years, and then I went off, and I had Steve House the party. Steve House, by the way, is a very he loves to do parties. Were you at my party with I got the John Pittman award?
No, I think I was out of town.
Yeah, you were out of town. Anyway, Steve loves to do parties, and he did a party for me, farewell to the chairmanship, at the Presidio Chapel. And it was really a party, and the mayor was there, and it was just so then he gave me when I got the John Pittman award. Steve did a party at that little Adobe,
The Pico Adobe.
Yeah, Pico Adobe, and so to reward him for those two parties, I gave him a painting. I see my painting up there. I gave him a oil painting of the courthouse, the steps that go up off of Santa Barbara Street.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful stair
with the wisteria. So that was it. And then I was not active in the government for a couple of years, and then Marty Blum called me up and she says, Bill, she says, we need a planning commissioner. We need a planning commissioner, and we don't like any of the people that have interviewed. And she said, I think the city council would like you. And I said, I don't think they would. She said, trust me, they would. And so I got appointed to planning commission, and I was on that for 8 years. And that was, we did a lot of stuff, including Cottage Hospital and the Sheffield Reservoir.
Oh yeah, the
park
cover.
I walk my dog there every morning now, and
it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's so much better than when it was a lake. And so we did that. A lot of stuff. The planning commission was very interesting, but different from the architectural review.
Very technical.
Yeah, much more technical. And then while I was still on a planning commission, there was a lot of these big houses started to pop up along shoreline, and the neighbors went berserk. And the city council realized that they had to have something to control residential development, and so they formed this commission. There's this committee that was really a good committee. It was I was on it, and I can't remember who else anyway, we had 2 people from Planning Commission, 2 people from ABR, 2 people from Landmarks Commission, 2 citizens, and I guess that was it. But anyway, we met for 2 years, open every other week, public meetings, and we wrote the single family design guidelines and ordinance, and established the single family design board. And then the city council appointed me for a 3-year term to be chair. So I was chair of the single family design board for 3 years. And then after that, I went off and for a couple of years, and then I came on Historic Landmarks Commission, which I enjoyed, I think, more than any of the other commissions. So,
I enjoy it too.
Yeah, well, because you're really downtown where the action is now, and that's important. So going way back to when I came to Santa Barbara, nothing was happening downtown, and then but Paseo Nuevo, that happened while I was still on ABR in the 90s. Now it's kind of fallen on hard times.
Yeah.
And I don't know what is going to come of that. What's going to come of Nordstrom's building and Macy's building? I think they're going to tear those down and do a housing project.
Something's got to happen.
I don't think that they can remodel those buildings into housing. They just don't work.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was my connection with design review. And you asked me, what was a building that I really liked above all else? Well, of course, I said the spa and a Greek church, but there's one other one, and that's the little visitor center down on Cabrillo. So I was appointed on a committee of 4 to review the bridges when the freeway was coming through by city council. There was I was on Julio Vena and I were on from ABR, and Henry Lenny and David Gebhardt were on from the Historic Landmarks Commission. And we reviewed, and then there was we reviewed Caltrans, what they were doing. So here's we seeing the drawings for the bridge that's going under State Street's going under the bridge and the freeway bridge. And I see the Larco Fish Building had a big X, red X, felt pen red X on it. I said, what's that? And the engineer, these engineers are so straightforward. They said, well, that's that little old stone building that's worthless and it's empty, and we have to, grade back at 45 degrees so that when we're in construction, so that that's an OSHA requirement. And he said the building's in the way, so he said it's gone. It's a goner. I said you can't tear down that. That's a historic building. And this engineer, he said, really quickly, he said, listen, he said, you find a place for it and I'll move it. And I said, okay, that was a challenge. And at the time I was on the Chamber of Commerce board, and we were having a thing up at Morro Bay right after that. And so I got up and I said, there's this little stone building. At the time, the Chamber of Commerce had a visitor center on the 500 or 600 block of State Street in one of those little stores where nobody could find. And, no parking. It was worthless. And they knew it. But they had somebody working there and they were paying for that. So I said, there's this little stone building. And I said, Caltrans will move it for us if we can find a site for it. And we could have our visitor center in that little stone building. And everybody was really positive about that. They said, listen, you can do that. You can find a site for it. We're behind you. And we'll blow, so on and so forth. We'll occupy it and we'll, So I went to Sheila. She was mayor and we were close. And I said, Sheila, we got to find a place for this little stone building. The Caltrans will move it if we can find a place. And she said, well, where do you think it could go? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I know where it can go. It can go in the corner of the parking lot down there on Santa Barbara Street and Cabrillo. I said, right at the corner, there's just some land there that's not being used.
Like a big planter.
Yeah, the big planter. And she says, okay. She said, that sounds like, she said, I'll take that to city council. And she took it there and they said, yeah, we'll give that to the stone building. And if what's the organization? The Chamber of Commerce. Yes. The Chamber of Commerce will occupy it and, blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay. And I went to the Caltrans and they said, okay, they'll clear that site. Somebody will clear that site and we'll move it down there. And so at the time I was working on the Greek church, and Mark Romasanta was a contractor. And I said, Mark, you got to help me out on this. And this is all for free. You got to clear that site. And I said, you got to do a foundation. And I said, you're going to get some plumbers in to help and electricians. And they said, this is all going to be really good, but it's got to be free. And he said, I'll do it. I think his father helped him. Mm-hmm. So I had the contractor, I had the subcontractors, I had the site, I had everything except for a water meter. And at the time, the city was had a water moratorium because of the drought. We were in the middle of the drought at that time. I went back to Sheila and I said, Sheila, I got to have a water meter. I've got to have a water meter. You can't have a building without a water meter. She said, okay, so I'll go to city council. And city council made one exception during that moratorium. They only made one exception for a water meter, and that was for that stone building. And when that building was on the wheels and they were bringing it down Santa Barbara Street, and I was walking backwards watching it come down the street there, that was one of the best times of my whole life. It was just like having.
Sounds extraordinary.
Yeah, and they put it down there, and Mark came in, and his guys, subcontractors, and he did all that work, and it's now they put an addition on it and bathrooms and everything. You know, it's just amazing. It's an amazing little center. And
Sheila,
thousands and thousands and thousands of people,
yeah,
visit that.
a perfect location for it, obviously.
Yeah,
Sheila told me a story that she and her mom used to go to that little stone building to buy their fish.
Larko, yeah, back in the old days. Yeah. So it's still there.
Well
They cut that building off and put these I-beams underneath it and picked it up. I couldn't believe it.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
These are fun little things.